I never thought the cold November air could cut deeper than the truth I was about to learn. But the night I pulled into my son Kevin's driveway for what was supposed to be our warm, ordinary Thanksgiving gathering, I felt something inside me fracture long before I understood why, and the strange part is that I didn't feel it in my chest or my gut or even my mind. It hit me in my hands first, trembling as I gripped the 2 gift bags I had brought for my grandkids. Little things I knew they'd love, toys and puzzles and the sort of simple joys grandparents live for. And as I walked up the path toward the softly lit porch, imagining the moment the kids would run out screaming, "Grandpa! Grandpa!" the way they always did, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket, a sound that felt out of place against the quiet suburban stillness, and when I pulled it out, expecting maybe Kevin texting that they were out of cranberry sauce or my daughter-in-law asking for a last-minute ingredient, I froze because the sender wasn't them. It was Claire, my partner of 8 years, the woman who'd never in her life interfered with my family plans. And her message was just 5 words, but each one hit like a separate blow. "Do not go inside. Call me." For a second I thought it had to be some mistake, a wrong send, or maybe she'd meant to text someone else. But then another message came through immediately. This one longer, rushed, almost panicked. "Please, I heard something. It's about Kevin. Don't go in until we talk." And in that moment, standing 5 steps from the front door of the house I once helped him put a down payment on, everything in me went quiet, like the world had sucked the air away, like some black void had opened inside my ribs, and I couldn't move forward or backward. I just stood there in this eerie stillness while behind the door I could hear faint laughter, clinking plates, voices preparing a holiday meal I was suddenly being told not to walk into. And I didn't know whether to feel afraid, angry, confused, or numb, because nothing made sense. Kevin had invited me himself a week ago, had reminded me twice, had told the kids I was coming. So what the hell could Claire have heard that would make her send a message like that? My phone buzzed again. This time not a text, but a voicemail notification from Kevin, and I swear my heart almost stopped because why the hell would he leave me a voicemail when I was literally outside his house? I pressed play, the cold air stinging my ears as his voice came through. Syrupy warm, too warm, the kind of practiced warmth people use when they want something or when they're covering something up. And he said, "Hey Dad, just checking in. We're all inside wondering where you are. The kids are disappointed. We really hope you didn't forget. If you're already here, come in. We're waiting." And something about the way he said disappointed made my skin crawl, like he was rehearsing a guilt trip, not expressing concern. And suddenly I felt this tidal wave of cold dread building behind my sternum because Claire's warning echoed again in my mind. I heard something. It's about Kevin. I stepped away from the door, slowly, my breath turning to mist, the bag swinging numbly from my hand. And as I moved back toward my car, the laughter inside the house dimmed, muffling into a distant, hollow sound, like I was walking away from a life that wasn't mine anymore. And when I finally sat in the driver's seat drenched in a cold sweat, my phone rang. Claire calling this time, and I answered with a shaking voice, saying, "What did you hear?" And she hesitated. I could hear it. I could feel it through the line, the kind of hesitation someone has when they know what they're about to say will break something permanently. And then she whispered, "Kevin is involved in your company's fraud case." For a moment I didn't breathe. My vision blurred. A sharp ringing filled my ears like a metal spike had been driven through my skull, and I said, No, that's impossible. He's my CFO. He's my son." But the way my voice cracked on that last word made something inside me collapse, because some part of me already knew, already feared, already suspected, that this wasn't some random accusation, not when Claire sounded like she was forcing herself not to cry, not when the company had been under investigation for months, not when millions had gone missing and paper trails were muddy and digital logs mysteriously altered. And I whispered again, weaker, "What did you hear? Tell me everything." And she took a shaky breath, saying she had overheard a conversation at an event she wasn't even supposed to be at. Someone bragging arrogantly, drunkenly, about how the scandal would fall on the old man long before anyone caught the real culprit. Someone mentioning Kevin by name, someone laughing about how Daddy trusts him too much. And as she told me all this, I felt the warmth drain from my body, leaving me hollow, frozen, barely human, because the idea that my own son, my flesh and blood, the child I raised, mentored, promoted, trusted, would be the architect of the very fraud that was threatening to destroy everything I had spent 35 years building. It felt like a blade twisting slowly in my spine, and the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that he had invited me to dinner tonight, knowing the storm was closing in around me, knowing federal auditors were circling, knowing the board was losing confidence in me, knowing investigations were tightening, and yet he still put on the act of the loving son, waiting behind that door with a warm dinner and a family smile, as if he hadn't already stabbed me in the back and was now twisting the knife with a holiday bow tied around it. And for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my own child. And that fear wasn't the kind that makes you run or cry or plead. It was the kind that makes your bones feel heavier, your heartbeat feel too loud, the kind that tells you you're standing on the edge of something irreversible. And as I sat there with Claire's voice trembling in my ear, I kept staring at the warm yellow glow coming from Kevin's dining room window, silhouettes moving inside, my grandchildren probably helping their mother set the table, completely unaware that the man carving the turkey tonight might also be carving up what was left of my life, and I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Even though I knew she had only just learned. But in moments of shock we don't ask fair questions. We ask desperate ones, and Claire apologized over and over, telling me she didn't want to believe it herself until she heard enough details to convince her this wasn't gossip. It was real, concrete, dangerous, and then she begged me again not to go inside, saying, "If he's willing to do this to you financially, I don't know what else he's capable of." And that sentence, God, that sentence, hit me harder than anything else because it forced me to confront something I had never once allowed myself to imagine. That Kevin, my boy who once cried when I killed a spider in the bathroom because he thought all creatures deserved mercy, who used to bring me handmade Father's Day cards with scribbled stick figures, who I taught to ride a bike and who I held on his first day of school when he was too scared to walk. In alone, that same boy might now see me as nothing more than collateral damage, an obstacle in the way of whatever ambition, greed, or desperation had pushed him into committing corporate fraud under my very nose. And as the weight of that thought crashed over me, something inside me stiffened, like a dying flame suddenly demanding one last breath of oxygen, and I said, "I need to call my lawyer." Because instinct took over, the survival instinct of a man who'd built an empire through storms, betrayals, boardroom wars, and brutal competition. A man who knew when the ground under him was cracking, he had two choices: fall through it or start climbing. And Claire quietly said, "I'll stay on the line as long as you need." But I told her no, that I needed a moment alone, and when I ended the call, the silence inside the car felt suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides as I stared at the cheerful Thanksgiving decorations in Kevin's yard. The pumpkin lanterns, the little wooden sign that said, "Welcome home," and the wreath on the door I helped him hang last fall. And I realized none of it had been for me, not really, because if Kevin could steal from the company I built brick by brick, if he could let the blame slide toward me knowing investigators were circling, if he could sit inside that house preparing a family dinner with a smile while my entire reputation hung by a thread he had personally set on fire, then all those warm gestures weren't signs of love, they were camouflage. And as that truth settled into my bones, I felt something shift in me, something ancient and cold, the same thing I imagine every betrayed father feels when he realizes his child has grown into a stranger, maybe even an enemy, and in that coldness I found clarity. I wasn't walking into that house as his father. I would be walking into the home of my company's saboteur, and that meant the man outside the door wasn't a dad anymore. He was the CEO of a collapsing empire who needed to know exactly where the knife had been plunged, how deep it went, and how to pull it out without bleeding to death in the process. So I put the car in reverse, the tires crunching softly over the gravel, and I drove away without looking back, my hands trembling so violently on the steering wheel that I had to tighten my grip just to stay in the lane. And when I finally reached an empty parking lot near the closed offices downtown, I sat there breathing like a hunted animal until I forced myself to dial the emergency number of my attorney, a man who had handled mergers, lawsuits, hostile takeovers, and crisis management for me for nearly 2 decades. And when he answered groggy but alert enough to hear the panic in my voice, I told him, "I need you to meet me at the office now. It's Kevin. He's behind the fraud." And even speaking the words made me feel sick, like I had just confessed to a crime I didn't commit, because betrayal has a way of making you feel dirty even when you're the victim. But my attorney didn't doubt me. Not for a second. He just said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." And while I waited in that empty lot, staring at the dark windows of the company I had poured my soul into, I kept replaying every interaction with Kevin over the past year. Every meeting where he had seemed distracted, every time he brushed off discrepancies as audit glitches, every moment where he insisted we didn't need a third-party forensic review, and with each memory, the timeline of his betrayal sharpened in my mind like a mosaic rearranging itself into a horrifyingly clear picture of who he had become. And as the engine idled quietly in the empty lot, I felt the first stirrings of something else besides fear, something that had been buried under decades of trust, love, and paternal instinct, a realization that the boy I raised had not only crossed a line but had obliterated it entirely. And in that realization, I found not despair, but the beginnings of resolve, a fierce, cold resolve that sharpened my thoughts like the edge of a scalpel. Because if Kevin thought he could manipulate, betray, and undermine me without consequence, he had underestimated everything I had learned about patience, strategy, and observation over a lifetime spent fighting cutthroat corporate wars, and I began forming a plan in my mind, step by deliberate step, visualizing how I would confront him not with the tremors of panic or the vulnerability of disbelief, but with the weight of the law, the certainty of evidence, and the power of a man who had been wronged and refused to be broken. And as I rehearsed the steps in my head, I pictured him sitting in that warm, deceptively cheerful dining room, smiling at my absence, oblivious to the storm I was assembling. And I imagined the moment I would hand him a folder of incontrovertible proof, watch the color drain from his face, hear the sharp, startled gasp that would confirm he understood the magnitude of what I held. And in that imagined moment, I felt the first rush of satisfaction. Not cruel, not petty, but precise, justified, earned, the satisfaction of a man reclaiming what had been stolen. A son's betrayal no longer a dagger twisting in secret, but a challenge I would meet with all the skill, knowledge, and patience at my disposal. And as I waited for my attorney to arrive, pacing the asphalt under the cold November sky, I felt the numbness of shock fading and being replaced by clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you decide you will not be a victim, that you will stand unflinching in the face of deceit. And I called Claire back briefly to update her, her voice small, frightened, yet grateful that I was not panicking, that I had shifted from emotional chaos into strategy. And even as I hung up, I felt my pulse settle, my breath deepen, and my mind sharpen, because anger without direction is fire without fuel. But anger with purpose becomes a weapon, and I knew this weapon was now mine. And when my attorney arrived, briefed me on every legal angle, every recent audit, every suspicious transfer, and every minute document trail that could implicate Kevin, I listened intently, taking in every detail, forming a precise mental map of the steps I would take to ensure justice. Not vengeance that would consume me, but measured, calculated justice that would make the betrayal undeniable and the consequences inescapable. And as we went over strategy, I realized that everything Kevin had counted on, my trust, my sense of family, the assumption that he was untouchable because he was my son, was about to become the very leverage I would use. And the deeper I thought about it, the more the pieces of my plan fell into place, from how I would gather incontrovertible evidence without tipping him off, to how I would confront the board to protect the company while exposing the fraud, to how I would orchestrate Kevin's own hubris to work against him, because he had grown arrogant, thinking that the warmth of a holiday meal and the comfort of my blind trust would shield him from accountability, and I knew that his overconfidence would be his undoing. And as the night stretched on, I felt something I hadn't felt since my first big corporate win decades ago. The intoxicating mix of fear, anticipation, and the raw power that comes from knowing that justice, true, undeniable justice, is not only possible, it is inevitable. And as I sat there drafting mental timelines, imagining the conversations, the confrontations, the precise moments where Kevin's composure would crack, where his practiced charm would fail him, I also felt the weight of responsibility, because this was not just about ego or anger. It was about protecting the company, the employees, the legacy I had built with my own hands, the very future of everything I had worked for, and that weight made the resolve in my chest heavier, stronger, colder, and in that weight, I found focus, the kind that blindsides fear, sweeps aside doubt, and transforms pain into meticulous, patient power. And I rehearsed every interaction in my mind, The way I would speak, the pauses I would take, the silent judgments I would let hang in the air, the way I would make Kevin feel the full impact of every choice he had made, every lie he had told, every time he had smiled in my face while quietly planning my ruin. And as I imagined that, I felt a heat in my chest, not of rage but of righteousness, of validation, and I began to understand that revenge, when it is earned, when it is precise, when it is wielded with intelligence and patience, is not cruelty. It is the art of balance restored, the scales tipping back toward fairness, and in that art, I was about to become a master because Kevin had played his hand recklessly, and I had all the time in the world to play mine, and I would play it perfectly, every detail accounted for, every risk mitigated, every move calculated until his downfall was as inevitable as the sunrise. And as I sat there, planning, waiting, visualizing, the world outside faded to nothing, leaving only the cold clarity of purpose, the dark thrill of anticipation, the quiet, almost sacred tension of a man who had been betrayed but refused to be broken. And in that silence, I realized something else. The satisfaction I would feel when the truth came out would not only be mine. It would be the universe's, the universe that had allowed betrayal to exist only so that justice could be executed. The universe that had waited for me to rise from shock, confusion, and despair to the point where I could wield this knowledge, this power, this cold, inevitable reckoning. And as I leaned back in my seat, eyes narrowing, fingers tapping the steering wheel to a rhythm only I could hear, I felt a rare kind of calm, because every step, every move, every word that would come in the next days, weeks, and months was already living in my mind, rehearsed, sharpened, prepared, and I knew with every fiber of my being that Kevin had no idea what was coming, that his smile tonight, his fake warmth, his careless invitations, were all leading him into a trap he couldn't see until it was too late. And as that thought cemented itself in my chest, I whispered to the empty lot, to the night, to the universe itself, "You wanted to betray me? Very well. I will make you regret it. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with the certainty of inevitability, the power of preparation, and the satisfaction of justice finally, perfectly served." The next morning, the city felt colder than usual, gray clouds dragging the light into muted shadows, as if the world itself had sensed the storm I was about to unleash. And when I walked into my office, keys jingling in hand, the familiar hum of computers and chatter of assistants and colleagues somehow sounded distant, irrelevant, because my focus was elsewhere, fixed entirely on Kevin and the meticulous plan I had begun crafting in the empty parking lot the night before, a plan that required patience, deception, and the careful construction of evidence so undeniable that even the most loyal apologist couldn't deny his guilt. And as I sat at my desk, sliding open a drawer I had never thought I'd touch with suspicion, I began to pull together the threads. Audit reports, expense sheets, email correspondences, server logs, each tiny discrepancy that had once seemed mundane now glaring like neon signs pointing to betrayal. And I realized how carefully Kevin had covered his tracks. How confident he had been in my ignorance, in my love, in my trust, and that confidence had blinded him, had made him careless, and that carelessness would be his undoing. And I started outlining exactly how to confront the board, which documents to release and when, how to phrase my words so that Kevin's arrogance would betray him in front of everyone, how to leave him thinking he had won until the very last second, until the final, crushing evidence landed with the inevitability of a sledgehammer. And as I worked, I felt the cold thrill of anticipation, a mix of rage, pride, and deep satisfaction that comes only from knowing that betrayal, no matter how personal, can be met with control, precision, and the sweet weight of justice. And every time I imagined Kevin's smug face turning pale, his practiced confidence faltering, his voice cracking as he realized the empire he thought he could manipulate was crumbling under the undeniable truth he himself had created, I felt a surge of vindication, a sense of balance restored to a world that had tilted dangerously for a moment, because revenge, I realized, was not about cruelty. It was about restoring the natural order, about showing the world, and him in particular, that actions have consequences, that deceit can be unmasked, and that the people you betray, underestimate, or manipulate are not powerless. They are often just waiting for the right moment to act, and I had found mine, and as I prepared, calling my attorney repeatedly, discussing every nuance, every scenario, every possible attempt Kevin might make to deflect, to lie, to manipulate further. I began rehearsing the confrontation in my mind in excruciating detail, every pause, every glance, every calculated statement, until the image of Kevin facing the full weight of truth in the boardroom was so vivid that I could almost hear the echo of his incredulous gasp, feel the heat of his shame, and sense the power shift as he realized, too late, that his childhood lessons of manipulation, charm, and false smiles were no match for the precision, patience, and sheer will of a man who had once trusted blindly and now would act decisively. And as the hours passed, I felt a strange serenity settle over me, because though I was fueled by anger and betrayal, that anger was no longer a fire threatening to consume me. It had been refined into something sharper, more precise, more controlled, a weapon honed for impact, and I began coordinating behind the scenes, making subtle inquiries with auditors, quietly securing witnesses, collecting every digital breadcrumb, every shred of evidence, every irregularity that Kevin had left in his arrogance, because I knew he would never anticipate that I, the man he assumed naive, trusting, and loving, had seen through every lie, had noted every misstep, and had been building the strategy to expose him in a way that left nothing to doubt. And the tension grew like a living thing inside me, every passing hour a tightening of the coil, because I understood that timing was everything, that the moment I struck, it had to be perfectly executed. And as I ran through the scenario again and again in my mind, pacing the empty office late into the night, I visualized Kevin sitting across from me, the board behind me, the evidence laid bare, his expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, fear, and anger, the very emotions he had inflicted upon me through his betrayal now mirrored back at him, in full force, and I allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction, because for the first time since I had discovered his actions, I felt truly in control, not manipulated, not victimized, but empowered. And as I prepared the final steps, I thought about the long nights, the sacrifices, the moments I had ignored to nurture him, to trust him, to give him the benefit of every doubt, and I realized that those moments were never wasted. They had been the foundation for understanding the exact measure of his ambition, his hubris, and his recklessness, and now that understanding gave me an unassailable advantage, and with that advantage, the inevitability of justice was no longer a hope, it was a certainty, and I felt a cold, dark thrill run through me as I imagined the moment he would finally recognize that the warm smiles, the family dinners, the laughter of children, everything he had counted on to shield him from accountability, was gone, replaced by scrutiny, exposure, and the undeniable truth. And as I sat there, staring at the piles of documents, emails, and forensic printouts that would act as my sword and shield, I felt the transformation inside me, from shock to despair to strategy, from fear to power, from victim to arbiter, and I knew that by the time this was over, Kevin would no longer be the boy I raised, nor the son I loved, but a man who had been faced with the consequences of his choices, a man who would understand, in a way no conversation could teach, that betrayal against a father, against a mentor, against someone who loved you unconditionally, comes at a price. And as I rehearsed the confrontation, the timing, the exact words to pierce through his arrogance, I felt the crescendo of satisfaction building, like a storm ready to break, and I whispered to myself in the dark office, under the dim fluorescent light, "This is coming, Kevin, and you won't see it until it's too late." And the next day, when I woke before dawn with a heaviness that wrapped around my ribs like iron bands, I knew this wasn't just another day in the timeline of a long brewing conflict, but the one that would mark a before and an after in my life and his. And as I showered, dressed, tightened the last button of my shirt with trembling fingers I forced to stillness, I felt the weight of years pressing against me, years of building him up, years of trusting him, years of convincing myself that his sharp tongue and colder ambitions were nothing more than youthful arrogance, years of excusing the things I should have confronted, but didn't, because the heart always hopes even when the mind knows better. And as I walked out into the crisp morning air, locking the door behind me, sliding into the driver's seat with a breath that felt like a blade inside my chest, I realized that what I was about to do was not just justice, not just revenge, not even closure, but a reclamation of myself, of the man I had been before betrayal hollowed me out, and that thought steadied me as I drove toward the office tower where the board meeting would take place. The city still waking, unaware that somewhere above its skyline, father and son were about to collide in a way no family should, And as the elevator doors closed around me, sealing me in that cold, metallic silence, I rehearsed the words again, the tone again, the exact moment when I would slide the evidence across the polished table and watch the truth detonate behind Kevin's eyes. And yet there was grief mixed with the anticipation, because even when someone betrays you so deeply, even when they weaponize your love against you, cutting them out feels like severing a limb, and I felt that pain throb beneath the adrenaline as the elevator rose floor by floor, and when the doors finally parted, revealing the empty lobby leading to the boardroom, every step I took felt heavier, like I was walking into a storm that would change me forever. And maybe that's exactly what I needed. Maybe I needed to be broken down to rebuild myself harder, colder, sharper. And as I pushed open the boardroom door, the long table gleaming under expensive lighting, the city glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind it, I saw them. The board members settling into their seats, old allies and seasoned executives who trusted my leadership, respected my judgment, and alongside them, leaning back in his chair with that same polished confidence he had learned to perfect since adolescence, was Kevin, crossing his legs casually, checking his watch as though nothing in the world could possibly threaten him, and the moment his eyes met mine, he smiled that smile. The one that always felt more like a mask than an expression. The one he used when he wanted to charm, manipulate, persuade. The smile he believed could soften any blow, and I wondered if he had even the faintest idea of the avalanche that was seconds away from crashing down upon him. But no, of course he didn't, because arrogance blinds itself, and betrayal always believes it will remain hidden, protected beneath the shadows of silence. But today there would be no shadows, no hiding, and as I sat down at the head of that long table, placing the folder of evidence beside me with a deliberate calm that felt like a tremor beneath my skin, I let the silence stretch, let Kevin shift ever so slightly in his chair, let the weight of my gaze unsettle him. And when I finally spoke, my voice was lower, darker, steadier than it had been in months, and every eye in the room turned toward me as I began with something simple, something routine, discussing quarterly performance, upcoming mergers, market projections, building the calm before the storm because I wanted Kevin relaxed, comfortable, certain he had dodged whatever suspicion he thought I might still carry, and for a moment, it worked. He leaned back even farther, lips curving into the faintest smirk, the kind people wear when they are convinced they have already won. And that was the moment I struck, slipping the first of several documents onto the table with a soft whisper of paper against wood that sounded louder than thunder in the quiet room. And I watched Kevin's eyes flicker down, casual at first, then narrow, then sharpen into something that wasn't quite fear but was close enough to satisfy a dark corner of my heart. And as I continued speaking, revealing each piece of evidence in smooth, measured waves, the falsified invoices, the shadow accounts, the unauthorized transfers, the manipulated projections, the room grew painfully silent, the air tightening like a noose, board members glancing between the documents and Kevin with widening eyes, expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to restrained fury, and with each unfolding revelation, I saw Kevin's facade crack, the polished composure he relied on splintering under the pressure of truth. His breath catching, his fingers twitching, his jaw tightening so sharply I could see the muscle jump along the side of his face, and when he finally spoke, his voice no longer held that confident, effortless charm. It trembled, just slightly, as he stuttered out excuses, half-formed explanations that crumbled before they even left his mouth, and it was in that moment, watching him scramble, watching him reach desperately for a lie that could save him, that I felt something shift inside me, something cold but that having survived this, having met betrayal with precision, patience, and unwavering calm, I would be ready. And as I stepped toward the elevator, the hum of the city below reaching up to meet me through the windows, I thought of Claire, of the early warning that had saved me from walking blindly into ruin, of the clarity that comes when you listen to the voices of those who see what you cannot, and I silently thanked her, knowing that sometimes survival and justice depend on not walking alone. And as the elevator doors closed, I allowed myself to feel the first warmth of hope since the night of discovery, a quiet ember of resilience glowing in the aftermath of chaos, and I reflected on the lessons that betrayal teaches, the cost of trust, the fragility of family ties, the danger of underestimating those you love, and the profound satisfaction that comes from seeing the truth unfold exactly as it must. And as I walked through the quiet streets, the city lights flickering softly, the cool November air brushing against my face, I realized that revenge, when executed with care, patience, and moral clarity, is not the poison it is often thought to be, but rather a force of balance, a statement of self-respect, a reclaiming of power stolen by deceit. And I knew that while Kevin's downfall would leave scars, the strength and lessons I had gained from this confrontation would last a lifetime, shaping me into a man wiser, colder, and more aware of both the beauty and the peril, of trust, and in that realization, I felt a deep, almost meditative calm, a certainty that I had acted not out of mere anger, but with precision, with purpose, with justice, and as the city hummed quietly around me, I whispered one last time into the night, a message to the universe, to Kevin, and to anyone who might ever underestimate the consequences of betrayal. This is what happens when you take what is not yours. But even knowing that, the ache inside my chest felt almost unbearable, because even the right choice can break you when it involves someone you once held in your arms as a baby, someone whose future you imagined brighter than your own, someone you would have sacrificed everything to protect. And I realized that this cold, brutal, necessary moment was my punishment for loving him too blindly, too deeply, too unconditionally. And yet, even as the board members began demanding Kevin be suspended pending a full forensic investigation, even as the weight of undeniable evidence pinned him into a corner he could no longer manipulate, I felt a strange, hollow ache, because justice, while satisfying, carries a loneliness that vengeance does not. And as I watched him gather his things, muttering half-hearted denials and excuses that sounded thin, weak, and transparent to everyone in the room, I realized that the son I had raised, the boy who once looked up to me with trust, who believed that love could shield him from all consequences, was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, a man who had allowed ambition, arrogance, and greed to define him. And in that moment, my mind flickered back to Claire, to the message that had saved me from walking into that house the night before, to the sudden clarity that had forced me to step back and see the betrayal in its entirety before it was too late. And I understood that survival, whether corporate or personal, is often about timing, patience, and recognizing when the people you love most have become capable of harming you in ways you never imagined. And as Kevin slumped in his chair, exhausted, defeated, his mask of arrogance shattered, his bravado evaporated, I felt a cold satisfaction unlike anything I had experienced in decades, a sense of balance restored, a scale tipped back toward the natural order of cause and consequence. And though part of me mourned the loss of the son I had known, another part of me marveled at the precision of the entire unfolding, the inevitability of the outcome that had been carefully orchestrated in my mind hours, days, and even months before, the satisfaction not of cruelty, but of righteousness, of earned justice, of seeing the consequences of deception laid bare and undeniable. And as the board began discussing next steps, asking for procedural recommendations, Kevin finally lifted his head and met my gaze. And in that look, there was fear, there was anger, there was shame, and in the shadows behind all of it, I saw the faintest glimmer of understanding, a silent acknowledgement that he had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. And as the room buzzed with the hum of decisive action, scheduling audits, freezing accounts, and contacting authorities, I felt the weight of my years, my experience, my patience, and my resilience settle over me like a mantle. And I realized that this was not just revenge, not just justice, not just a reclamation of power. It was a testament to the strength of foresight, of preparation, of refusing to be destroyed even when the people you love most try to be the instruments of your downfall. And as Kevin finally stood, shoulders slumping under the invisible load of exposure and accountability, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in what felt like years, letting the tension drain from my body, the adrenaline fall away, leaving only the calm, cold satisfaction of a plan, executed perfectly, and I could almost hear the universe exhaling with me, acknowledging that the scales had been righted, that the reckoning had arrived, and that in the darkest corners of betrayal, there is always a way to emerge not only unbroken but stronger, wiser, and more in control than ever. And as the boardroom emptied and Kevin was escorted away under the watchful eyes of legal counsel and security, I lingered a moment, letting my gaze fall on the city skyline through the glass windows,